All right, welcome everybody to Standing for Truth. My name is Donnie Bedinsky, and I am your host for today's important program. It is a privilege, as always, to have Dr. Jerry Bergman here with me for a presentation on the Scopes monkey trial. Specifically, the title of this presentation is The Other Side of the Scopes monkey trial. I know you in the audience have been excited for this since we said it, and I am excited as well. Now, Jerry has been an incredible blessing to this ministry. I am thankful for his dedication to defending the faith and also upholding the truth of biblical creation, which is of utmost importance to us here at Standing for Truth Ministries. You can find Dr. Bergman's previous presentations here with us in the description box of this video. The last time he was here, Dr. Bergman spoke on his book dealing with bacteria, viruses, and other pathogens. I highly recommend people check out that talk and discussion if you have not yet seen it. Now, before we get into the presentation for today, I do want to give my guest, Jerry Bergman here, an introduction. Dr. Jerry Bergman has taught biology, genetics, chemistry, biochemistry, anthropology, geology, and microbiology for over 40 years at several colleges and universities, including Bowling Green State University, Medical College of Ohio, where he was a research associate in experimental pathology, and the University of Toledo. He is a graduate of the Medical College of Ohio, Wayne State University in Detroit, the University of Toledo, and Bowling Green State University. He has over 1,300 publications in 12 languages and 40 books and monographs. As a matter of fact, I got at least a few of his books behind me, so I do highly recommend people check those out. His books and textbooks that include chapters that he authored are in over 1,800 college libraries in 27 countries. So far, over 80,000 copies of the 60 books and monographs that he has authored or co-authored are in print. Jerry, it's great to have you back. How are you today?
It's great to be here.
I appreciate it. I'm excited for your presentation on the other side of the Scopes monkey trial. So I think we'll just get right into it. I will get your presentation up on the screen. Dr. Bergman, before you begin, I will let our live audience know that we will be doing an audience Q&A immediately following Jerry's presentation. So please, if you do have a question, just let me know. You can tag me at Donnie or at Standing for Truth. Dr. Bergman, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Scopes trial, you might wonder why I have an interest in the Scopes trial. Well, this trial is one of the most infamous or famous, depending upon your viewpoint, trials in American history. And it has drastically changed the perception of conservative Christianity. And ironically, a major way they've done this is by name calling. And I have a collection of probably 300 cartoons, and I'll show you a few of them. And cartoons really say a lot about how they respond to us. And evolution, Scopes trial, speak not, hear not, see not. We've seen that before. And then next to it, we have Williams, Jennings, Bryan, thou shalt not think. And of course, the perception is that those who reject evolution are not thinking. And this is a cute one, down with education, to hell with truth. And there's a fundamentalist dragging his poor young son through the mud of superstition. And this one, our children, thou shalt not, tree of knowledge, thou shalt not pick from the tree of knowledge. And notice the words evolution, archaeology, and biology are up there. Another one, you can see that, I guess is supposed to be Bryan or somebody else, but you can see the image, shadow, looks like a monkey. And of course, he doesn't like to see that. And then on the other side, this is from a journal called Evolution. And they're showing you here the picture from it, December 1927. And you can see scientific proof of evolution. Well, the umbrella is not working because there's no proof of creation. This is more recent, by the way. Some of these are almost 100 years old. Some of these are a couple of years old. So the same response is given today to respond to us. Obama doesn't love America. This is Governor Perry stating that. Bernanke is a traitor. Evolution's a theory. Trying to show that this is an ignorant way of responding to the facts. And here we can see evolution from a frog to an ape, and then a caveman, and then Kansas Board of Education. And they, of course, debated whether or not they should include critiques of evolution in their classes. And you can see they're showing us, the creationists, as clowns. And this is what they call a progression from apes to man. And in the middle, they have a creationist. Earth is only 10,000 years old. And of course, the goal is to make fun of creationists. Which brain was donated to intelligent design? Which brain does intelligent design people have? Not A, not B, but C. So people who accept the intelligent design worldview have a small brain. And this is more direct brain of man, and then Neanderthal, a little bit smaller, which is, of course, not true. The brain of Neanderthal was larger than the average man today. Brain of Homo erectus, brain of ape, and then brain of a creationist at the far right. And then this is another reference to the Supreme Court, what they mean by they crack about some evolving slower than others. And of course, you can see two men who don't look like they're very well evolved. And this is knocking creation and intelligent design. And the Pope Francis, they claim, is accepting science and rejecting creation and intelligent design. And there you can see the science facts has smashed the creationists and ID supporters. And then creationism in public schools, we have what obviously is a priest or a monk there, pouring creationism into the tied up student. And of course, teacher is taking away the evolution sign and opening the brain to allow kids to pick up this creation nonsense. And then here, this one, and this I think is a newer 2004. Evolution on one side, all the facts, of course. Faith on the other side. And the person says, see, they have equal weight. Therefore, they should have equal footing in the classroom. And there we can see a teacher who is trying to teach creation, I guess. And, well, he's tied up and got a mask on, scarf on, so he doesn't say anything. And I guess they're saying that he should not be able to say what he believes as an evolutionist. And this is The Onion, a paper which makes fun of lots of things. And they ask it's of course mocking, is science being taught in our schools? ? Should children be exposed to facts? Are reasonable and empirical evidence suitable school subjects? They ask. And then we can see the evolution again from a fish to humans, and then de-evolution of those who advocate the idea that we ought to teach creationism in our schools. And here is a cartoon of a creationist and intelligent design in this case, and there he is with a costume, and the teacher says, well, we're going to now explain intelligent design. And then here is a teacher who applied for a job, according to the cartoon, at this school. And the clerk, the secretary, says, there's a scientific creationist here to apply for the position of biology teacher. And of course, the evidence they have here is an apple and a snake. And then this one is where a man is walking. The last time, stop following me, I'm a creationist. Supposedly denying all of these precursors to modern man. And when we look at the surveys, and there are many, the question is, human beings, as we know them, developed from earlier species of animals. And we can see Iceland, 80% accept that worldview, true. Denmark, about 80%. Sweden, about 80%. France, so on, and we get down to the two countries that the least number accept the idea of evolution of man. And Latvia and USA and Turkey are right at the far end, which basically says that we are, ironically, that's an interesting comparison because, of course, the United States has been for decades the technological leader in the world. And it's interesting that we have contributed so much to the world, including computers and chips and transistors and on, and yet we have the highest percent, well, 40%. By the way, that number's going down each year. It used to be something like 60%, and it's going down partially because we have so much indoctrination in the public schools. And here we can see Nobel laureates from different countries, and just a glance at that chart shows which country by far is leading in the number of Nobel laureates. Hands down, United States, clearly. And so it's interesting, which of course evolutionists don't point out, but we have among the highest percent of creationists in America, and ironically, we have one of the highest levels of Nobel laureates compared to any other country in the world. Great Britain, second, Germany, third, France, it's there. Sweden's got a few, Switzerland, very few, Russia, very few, Japan and China, which surprised me. They have hardly any Nobel prizes. And then trust the science. This man says, I do trust the science, but coercion is not science. Very true. Censorship is not science. Very true. Fake data is not science. Manipulating results is not science. Cherry picking studies is not science. Fear mongering is not science. Now, this was a cartoon the evolutionists created, and they referred to evolution here, but indeed we can see that what's happening is the science, so-called science, are the ones practicing all of these problems. And I'm aware of that because I've written now 5 books which document indeed that if you question the evolutionary orthodoxy, you could well lose your position or at least have problems. Another cartoon, this is not a science book, pointing at the Bible. And Mencken on Bryan, we should stress that Mencken was really a very nasty person, very anti-South, very anti-minority, very ironically anti-Jewish, which he made very clear his contempt for Jews. But anyways, Mencken said, he leads a new crusade. One somehow pities, talking about Bryan, one somehow pities him despite his so palpable imbecilities, but let no one laughing at him underestimate his frayed but still eloquent voice. He can shake and inflame these poor ignoramuses as no other man among us. And here is 2 well-known books which talk about the Scopes trial. Some are for the Gods, which is really comparatively pretty good. But it says, continuing the debate over science and religion, and that is not what the Scopes trial was about at all. The core was about racism, as I will show. And in essence, they try to stress science and religion, and really it was not Bryan that was looking at that issue, but it was Darwin, the other side. In fact, he stated his whole goal of being there was to lambast religion, referring to conservative religion. And this is the cover of another book, The Great Monkey Trial, Science versus Fundamentalism in America. And this is a theme in many of these books. Again, science versus religion. And then this is my book, The Other Side of the Scopes Monkey Trial. At its heart, the trial was about racism. And that is really well documented. In the Commoner is a magazine that was written by several people, that was edited by Bryan, and he did quite a bit of editing too. And he expressed his concerns clearly about the, quote, the Negro population, stressing that education advantages should be open to both races. Now, he did that in an article published in 1902. And that was a long time ago. That was 50 years before the Civil Rights Movement. And yet what Bryan was advocating in this article was basically what the Civil Rights Movement was able to achieve. Let me get a little drink of water here. But this is a picture from Scientific American. And this is the evidence in 1923 that was used in the Scopes trial. The Java man, Piltdown man, Neanderthal man, and of course Cro-Magnon. So this was the evidence. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is look at this evidence. And there's another example. This is from a biology book. Edward Rice, 1935, this was done. And this illustrates the fact that this evidence was still being talked about decades after, in fact, not only decades, but several decades after the Scopes trial, even though a lot of this, well, all of this has been now disproved. Java man, there's Java man. And you can see the skull tops there, the head of the skull. And that was the evidence for Java man. That's it. That's Java man. And it's debated. In fact, it was debated even back then of what these skull tops represented. But you can see how much artistic license they utilized to end up drawing Java man the way they did. And then there are femurs, which were found in that same area. But the conclusion is that these femurs are those of modern man. And there's Java man. We can see from the skull top, we end up with a whole drawing of a person. The problem with this is that you have an ape head and a very modern human body. When I present this, I have no small number of men state that, boy, I wish I had a body like that. It's quite an impressive body. But yet, why don't they have an ape head? Why don't they have an ape body? Well, the problem is in most of these fossils, all they have is the head. They have no evidence of the body. So they have to use artistic license to add a body. But still, I would think they would try to at least draw a more ape-like body instead of a very modern man body. And here is a picture in a magazine. And we can see 3 drawings. One is a chimp. And in the middle is with Java man, basically. Dubois Pithecanthropus erectus. And then we can see a native who looks somewhat like an ape. And this is a focus of a number of my articles showing that evolution was blatantly racist. Okay, the argument is basically the fossils represent the missing link between apes and humans. And Dubois gave the species the scientific name, which we still use today, Pithecanthropus erectus, meaning walking ape man. Another article, this fossil aroused much controversy. Even back then, it aroused much controversy. And this article from Roger Lewin, published in 2000, this fossil, the Java man, aroused much controversy. Within a decade of the discovery, almost 80 books or articles were published on Dubois' finds. Despite his argument, though, few accepted that Java man was a transitional form between apes and humans. And so this goes back to even when the Scopes trial occurred, that there was a lot of debate on whether this was a valid transitional form. And there's a whole book which covers this. And this book shows the problems throughout history and even today relative to Java man. There's Piltdown man, one of the most famous examples of, actually, most famous example of fraud and forgery. And what they found was a lot of skull pieces, and this has been effectively debunked by 6 or 7 different books that have gone into detail. The only real question is who did the forgery, and my conclusion is it was the same guy that so-called discovered it. And there you can see the leading scientist pondering Piltdown man. And this was seen as an important evidence of evolution up until the 1950s. And it has now been, of course, effectively debunked, but it was widely accepted for decades. And there we can see the Piltdown man on the left. You can see he's drawn to be very ape-like. And then on the other illustration, you can see where they were trying to determine the sizes of different parts of the skull to determine the evolutionary status. Okay, Fossil Man of Sussex, and that's Piltdown again, and they're one of many articles about it. And now, Unraveling Piltdown, these are two of many books that are, I think about 12 books I have that deal with the Piltdown forgery. Who done it was the big question, and we don't know for sure, but I think the guy who discovered it was the one that did it. Okay, Neanderthal man, the next most common one. I've had a cough recently, so I talk too much, my wife tells me, but okay, there's Neanderthal man. These are drawings of what he looked like. Neanderthal man was seen as a major evidence of evolution for almost a century, human evolution for almost a century. And this is one of many drawings of Neanderthal man. Another example of not only Neanderthal, but others. You can see again, ape-like head and very human modern body, which to me, I think they ought to at least make it look like a transitional form, but they aren't. Anyways, now Neanderthal today, we can see in a museum in Germany, of all places. He's all dressed up and no place to evolve, says the text here. And this is a display of Neanderthal man in a Neanderthal museum in Germany. And then we see a picture of a young girl. What they did is they took the bones of Neanderthal, assembled them the best they could. And we are really good at this because we take fossils of people, of skulls, for example, people who died, and we try to put a face on them so we can determine who they are. And there are many well-known cases where that was done. One is they found skulls, parts, they assembled the skulls together, and they had one of these reconstructing experts put a face on it. They put the face on TV, and they said this was the bones of a woman found in this park. Do you know who it is? And ironically, it didn't take long, and somebody called the FBI and said, yeah, I think this is my neighbor who disappeared about 7 years ago. And it looks just like her. And this skull, they estimate was there for about 7 years. And they're able to convict the husband of killing his wife. And his wife was the skull bones they found. And here's another case where they reconstruct Neanderthal from, again, original bones. And it looks just like, well, a person that you would see walking down Main Street. And it looks very, very real, but this is a reconstruction by individuals who, well, they know how to do this. They've done this for decades for forensic work. And now National Geographic finally gave the death knell. And this is the other humans, Neanderthals revealed. And this article basically says that they are simply another category of a ethnic group of humans. That's all. And this is 16 years ago this was made. So it is now clear from, I guess, everybody who knows anything about this, that Neanderthals are simply another group of people, another people group. So Piltdown is gone. Neanderthal is down. Java man was, for a long time, was recognized as down. And there are other cases, Homo rhodensius, but again, we can see the racism involved in so many of these pictures look like African Americans. And again, very modern human body, but a very ape-like figure. Rhodesian man, this was done in 1922, the drawing. And now it's this, the fossils they found was a southern representative of the Neanderthal race. And it's not an intermediate between Neanderthals and modern man. And here you can see another, the Cro-Magnon man. Cro-Magnon is one more that was mentioned in the Scopes trial. That's always been a problem because Cro-Magnon really, in so many ways, is fully human. Now, these drawings, of course, don't show that very accurately because they're exaggerated for effect. It's called artistic license. And there you can see pictures that are still around: Neanderthal man, Cro-Magnon man, and modern man. So they're still showing you this in what they call the progression, which is by far one of the most famous drawings of ape men ever produced. And now there's a skull, which, guess what? That's a Cro-Magnon. And what do we know from that skull? It could be yours, could be you. This Cro-Magnon skull looks just like our own. It's not complete, of course. It's distorted because of pressure when these skulls are buried. The rock formations tend to produce problems. And here is the famous progression. And again, the most primitive, the afarensis, the most primitive ape, perfectly modern human body, an ape-like head. And I just find this appalling. You think that they would at least try to show some evidence. And I think many people look at this and they glance at it and they get a mental picture and don't go beyond that. Hesperopithecus was about the time the Scopes trial was being questioned already. So, but it still was one of those links that they used. And this is a famous drawing of Hesperopithecus. And this was an ape man based on a tooth. And that tooth now we recognize in not too long ago was a pig's tooth. And that may seem surprising to people because, well, there's a big difference between a pig and a man, but that's true. But on the other hand, that shows that many parts that from pigs, for example, are very human. And you have other examples that certain organs are taken from a pig or a other animal, because in many ways, so-called primitive animals have structures that are very close to modern man. And this is example of this pig's tooth, which is again pretty close to a modern man's tooth. And in this book, Earth Speaks to Bryan, Henry Fairfield Osborn, which I think this was 1927, around that time this book was written, and he still accepted Hesperopithecus, even though there were questions raised at this time. And this is an article in Science magazine, the leading science magazine in the world. And hard to believe the small water-worn tooth, 10.5 millimeters by 11 millimeters, is the evidence for primitive arthropod primates in North America. Well, that, of course, today is embarrassing, but that's an article, an article in Science. And then Henry Fairfield Osborn, another article. It's the first arthropod primate found in America, is what he claimed. And this is from Science magazine, and this was about 1927, so it was a couple of years after the Scopes trial. But you can see this was the accepted evolutionary tree. And we can see still on this tree, we can see, well, here's the number. And then whites 11, right here. Chinese 10. And this highest evolution to lowest, you can see that slightly in the drawings. And Negroes number 9. And 8 Australian, right here. Cro-Magnon, which of course we've seen now is accepted as simply another variation of modern man. Cro-Magnon would be right here. And then Piltdown, still included, would be number 1. Although that wasn't fully debunked until the 50s. So you can see why it would be. Another example, this is a 1927 article in Science. And again, we can see how these claims were still there, even though they have now been fully refuted. And what about new findings? I'm only looking in this PowerPoint at findings which were accepted in 1925. But since then, myself, Peter Lyell, Jeffrey Tompkins, and Daniel Biddle wrote a book which basically shows that all the claims for our evolutionary ancestors have all been refuted by other paleoanthropologists. And so even though this claim is commonly made, even today, we can see the literature shows clearly many problems in these claims. And vestigial organs, this was also brought out at the Scopes trial. And this is one example where I have spent quite a bit of time showing that vestigial organs, there was at one time over 100, and now it's recognized that there are none left when we look at the literature. And this is a film that I did on that topic. And we can see this is a book of mine which has been translated into Arabic. Just today, I was pointed out to me that one of my books is a bestseller in Arabic. And there's like 27 reviews of that book. But I can't read it because it's all in Arabic. But they're very positive according to the site, which was Goodreads, is where I found this on. And these are two books which I completed, which deal with the claims of evolution, useless organs, and I have well over 100 that I discuss in here in some detail, and poor design claims as well. And Genesis 1:27, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Acts 17:26, from one man, Adam, he made every man and woman and every race of humanity, and he spread us over all the earth. Now, we talked about Bryan earlier and what he had to say. It's really good to go into detail about what his ideas were and how he was a half a century ahead of the time. Again, 1902, he wrote, quote, about the legal rights of the black man. There can be no question. The Negro is a citizen, and as a citizen, he is entitled to all of the guarantees of the federal and state constitutions. And again, this was heresy in many parts of the South during the time of the Scopes trial. And this is why I believe Bryan did not bring this out in the Scopes trial, because he realized that if he advocated some of these ideas, he probably in Tennessee would have been ridden out of town. And then he continued here. He has, the black man has freedom to speak and to write, freedom of conscience, and the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those who pushed Jim Crow laws wanted to prevent the full integration of people judged of inferior racial stock. And Bryan responded, the Negro must be educated. The whites, for their own as well as for the good of the Negroes, must ensure that public schools are open to every child, white and black. And again, the integration of schools in the 50s, if you've watched the reels, film reels from this time period, it's very clear that there was horrendous opposition. They did not want a single black child in the white schools and had no qualms about rioting. Thousands of young people were rioting. The police had to use fire hoses to prevent them from big problem. And I think several people were killed, but there were thousands rioting to make sure that no Negro is going to go to a white school. And here he's advocating that in 1902. So my guess is it's pretty good reason why he did not present this information in Tennessee, in Dayton, Tennessee. That's the book Scopes used. Civic Biology, George W. Hunter. And I managed to find a good copy of that. Now you see copies in various used bookstore sites, and they go for hundreds of dollars. And then this is a quote from the book. Eugenics was one of the primary reasons Scopes prosecutor William Jennings Bryan came to oppose the teaching of human evolution. And this is an article by a scientist in the Journal of the History of Biology, acknowledging basically my main point. So my main point is really not hidden, but it's rarely talked about. I have well over 100 books about the Scopes trial, and rarely is this even mentioned. In fact, I had to go outside of the books to find a author which recognized that eugenics was one of the primary reasons Scopes' prosecutor came to oppose the teaching of human evolution. And Larson does briefly mention that, but not in very much detail in this book here. Quotes, if the stock of domesticated, this is from the book, the Civic Biology, the Hunter book. If the stock of domesticated animals can be improved, okay, now that's true. Obviously, we can do that. We've done that. Therefore, Hunter said, the health and vigor of the future generations of men and women on the earth might be improved by applying to them the laws of selection. And this is a nice way of teaching eugenics. Hunter also, he introduces eugenics as well-born or good breeding. Then he jumps to the fallacious stories of the Jukes and the Kallikaks. And I have a whole article I just completed on that, and that was basically a fraud. They basically made up the data. It just has been shown to be untrue. But nonetheless, that book was very important in this country. It's found not only in Hunter's book, but it's found in many other sources, and it was exploited by the Nazis, and one of the main reasons that they advocated the inferior race idea, and also why they advocated eugenics. And really what World War II is trying to do, and I've done quite a bit of writing on this, it's very well documented, what they're trying to do in World War II was basically breed a superior race, or at least maintain the superiority of a race, the Aryan race. And what they did not want to do clearly was interbreeding the superior race, the Aryans, with inferior races, including Poles, Slavic people, Russians, Jews, which ironically they listed as an inferior race for many reasons, and other groups. And one thing I learned in studying World War II is that the major focus was not to win the war. Given the choice of winning the war or killing the Jews, the government made it very clear that more important was to kill the Jews, and that way we can eliminate the pollution of the superior race, or at least reduce its likelihood. And therefore, when the concern was we need supplies and troops to the front in Russia, please send them, Hitler said, no, we're going to use those trains not to send supplies to the front. We're going to use those trains to send Jews to the concentration camps. And they made it very clear, he did. And the concern was, we're going to lose the war. Well, then that happens. We want to win the war, but on the other hand, it's more important to eliminate the Jews. Jukes was a family from New York that supposedly produced a large number of criminals. And the I can never pronounce that. Well, it's not a real word. So Kallikaks. And this basically is the same thing, where they tried to prove that a good woman and good husband produced great kids, all became very successful. But the same man, ironically, and a bad woman, a woman he supposedly met in a bar, a drunk, they produced a family of lots of criminals, recalcitrants, and bad people. And here's a chart of the Kallikak family. And you can see he dallied with a feeble-minded tavern girl. There she is. And you can see all the kids that were produced. Didn't turn out very well on that side. The other side, he married a worthy Quaker. And we can see that they all did really well. In fact, we have documents of a lot of the people from this generation which did extremely well. And this data was distorted, especially the dallying with a feeble-minded tavern girl. And here you can see the book, and you can see this is one of the girls. In fact, this is what started the whole thing. And when I look at it, this woman was supposed to be feeble-minded. And she was illiterate. She couldn't read. But I find it interesting that many of the books show her in her favorite activity, which was reading. And yet the claim that she couldn't read was made in the book that Henry Goddard wrote about this family. The book Scopes used Also stated the race of man, at the present time there exists upon the earth 5 races, or varieties of man, very different from each other. These are the Ethiopian or Negro type, originate in Africa, in the Malay or brown race, then the American Indian, then the Mongolians or yellow race, and finally the highest type of all, and that is the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. And this book again was used not only in America, but it was exploited by the Nazis. At the Nuremberg trials, one of the main arguments is, look, why are you condemning us when we are doing exactly what you in your eugenics books advocated? We're just following your pattern. And our only defense was, that's true, you got your ideas from Americans and American writers, but you took it one step further. We didn't kill anybody. We sterilized a lot of women and some men, but we didn't kill anybody. But you took it to the next step, and that is you killed 6 million Jews and 6 million Slavics, etc. Improvement of man, this again is from the book. If the stock and domesticated animals can be improved, it is not unfair to ask if the health and vigor of the future generations of men and women on the earth might not be improved by applying to them the laws of selection. That is, in a core, eugenics. And eugenics, basically, I kind of repeat myself here, but basically we have diseases, we have feeble-minded people. How do we eliminate this? By eugenics. The cost to society he brings out is horrendous. They do harm to themselves. They corrupt, they steal, they spread disease. So how do we deal with this? By sterilizing women who are prone to produce children that may indeed cause problems. The remedy, if such people were lower animals, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading, and humanity will not allow this. And this, by the way, is from Charles Darwin's writing. And so the ideas that he advocated have been used to explore eugenics and apply it to human life in America with sterilization, and likewise in Europe with eugenics used to kill people, namely the Jews, the Slavics, and so on. And this is my book, which I wrote in detail, this issue. And ironically, it's one of my best sellers. No matter where I go, I was just at a church this Sunday. And as usual, I should know better. As usual, I sold every copy I had. I had, a couple of piles of them, and I thought I had enough, but I didn't. So it's really done well. It's got 78 ratings, which is pretty good for a book on Amazon. And the negative ratings I always find interesting. And this one here I find especially interesting, that Bergman blames all the problems of the world on Darwin. And it's just foolish, and not blame all the problems, of course, but certainly his influence on Hitler is without dispute. I don't know any scholar who's looked into detail into this has refuted or claims that I'm wrong. Okay, in summary, Hunter believes society could perfect the human race by preventing the intermarriage between people, namely the mentally ill, which was a problem because their assessments, like this girl I showed you earlier, were that this girl was feeble-minded, but she was multi-talented. One of my articles I wrote, she had a lot of talents I wish I had. And someone mentioned that you might call her mentally deficient, but I'll tell you, you're not going to conclude that if you were in a game of some hard card game with her, because she was really quick. And I forget the game they mentioned, but it was a game that still takes a lot of skill to do well at. He also believed that the Caucasian race was the highest type of all the races. And of course, Hitler didn't use the term Caucasian. He used the term Aryan, which is basically the same thing. And this is a book, Our Face from Fish to Man, by William Gregory. And this, again, is a good summary of what they believe. We started out as fish. We worked our way up to primates, and then worked our way up to, you'll notice the black person there, and the highest race would be the Caucasian. And so this is one example of many, which indeed shows the harm that racism has done in this country. And I've written quite a bit about this. It's so well documented. And of course, evolutionists are so incredibly embarrassed. And they say, well, that was true a long time ago, but it's not what we hold today. It's not what we believe today. Well, that's true. It's not believed today, but boy, it was for about 130 years, it was believed, and had a horrifically negative effect on society. And when I point this out, people say, yeah, these are, 50, 100 years old, these pictures. Well, this is 1961, a Life magazine, and you can see the same distorted images of African Americans and apes assembled together. And of course, ironically, in this case, you've got, looks like Caucasians, and then primitive man pictures in this book. There you can see William Stanley Bryan in the Scopes trial. This is a picture taken from after the Scopes trial was, or I think during it. And there you can see Bryan and Clarence Darrow. And they were the opposites in the trial. Bryan was they call him a fundamentalist, but he wasn't really the fundamentalist as we look at today. He was a liberal. He was a liberal history, and evolution does not. On the other side, you can see Darrow, who was an out-and-out atheist and was very concerned about the teaching of the Bible, that it needs to be not allowed in the schools. And there's another picture of the Scopes trial. We can see how hot it is. People had ties on, but quite a few of the people had ties that were unbuttoned. And there's Scopes himself. And that's the end of the show.
Jerry, as always, excellent research, great presentation. You gave a presentation here a while ago. You've given many. And so for those that want to see your previous presentations, go to the Standing for Truth Ministries website. Under guests, click Dr. Jerry Bergman, and you'll find his previous presentations. One that you gave was C.S. Lewis, anti-Darwinist. And so I have your book here. That's another excellent example of the research that you do. And these presentations are so important because you don't hear enough about, for example, today, the Scopes monkey trial. And so you made a lot of great points, and we have some questions based on those points.
Okay.
Jerry. So we'll start with maybe the most relevant. So you had a good section on Neanderthal and how 100 years ago they were depicted as some half ape, half man, brutish type of creature. But now today, especially based on the genetic data, you showed a picture of what a Neanderthal child would look like, and looks fully human. If you saw a Neanderthal child walking down the street dressed in modern day clothes, you would think that that's a human right there.
Right.
So the question is, Jerry, and I've got it up on the screen, what are your thoughts on those that argue Neanderthals? And so there's many evolutionists, but also some old earth creationists that would argue Neanderthals are not fully human, and they base this on their genetics, because Neanderthals have some genetic markers that we as modern humans don't have, and modern humans have some genetic markers that Neanderthals don't have. And then also their morphological differences, like in the skull and the occipital bun. So they would argue that Neanderthals are actually not human. What would be a good response to that?
Well, that would be pretty racist and sexist and a few other things to make that claim today, because it's widely accepted. In fact, this was accepted something like 30 and 40 years ago. But since then, almost every other month or twice a year, articles come out showing that Neanderthals practiced music. They made musical instruments. Instruments work quite well, and you can use them today. You clean them up and so on. And their artwork is in many ways excellent. And so they buried their dead, and among the burial, we find evidence of flowers. So there are so many areas that we find Neanderthals were in so many ways like we are. But on the other hand, there are people today, and of course, a good example is the Australian Aborigines, which we used to claim were not fully human because indeed they have traits which are not that close to you and I. If you find the skull of an Aborigine, you find there are differences. So what I conclude is, and this is generally concluded today, is that these are people who had different traits. They're simply people differences. Of course, creationists stress we're all descendants of Adam and Eve, and therefore we're all related. Our fathers, mothers don't go all the way back to Adam and Eve, and therefore we're all genetically related. But that doesn't mean there's no differences. There are differences, of course, between racial groups. Between, again, we don't like to use the term racial because there's only one race, the human race, but there are differences between different groups, and these differences produce people groups, and therefore there are morphological differences, but of course that's just human trait differences. And every now and then I find a person who looks just like a Neanderthal. And I hate to say this, but I was in church one day, and this guy that sat behind me, boy, he was a perfect Neanderthal. And I mentioned to my wife, "Oh, I'd love to get a picture of him." And she said, "Don't you dare, don't you dare." And when I was teaching, there was a professor at Bowling Green State University that just looked, he just perfect Neanderthal. And I mentioned this in anthropology class later, and one of the students, her father was a professor at Bowling Green. And when I mentioned this, she said, "Oh yeah, I know who you mean. Yeah, he's a perfect Neanderthal. But as far as we know, his German background, and he just has these traits, and nobody knows whether or not is he related to Neanderthals? Well, physically he looks like one, but on the other hand, I understand in both these cases, their family traits go back to 300 or 400 years from Germany. So, end of story.
Great points. I mean, we could point to, and you have pointed to in previous presentations here, to actors, boxers. There's one specific Russian boxer, Nikolai, I think his name is, where they have that distinct Neanderthal trait in the brow ridge. So modern day people have Neanderthal traits.
Yeah, the genetics, I have a question whether or not, assuming they are as old as evolutionists say they are, I have a question whether or not these comparisons are valid. Because when I taught forensics, we had cases where someone died in like 1942, and we had, how do you determine who they are? They did genetic analysis, and the courts over and over says you cannot do genetic analysis with someone who died in 1942. You know when they died. So assuming it's that same person, it's not valid because you're going to have a lot of distortion, cosmic radiation, and so on. Genetic chains are quite easy to break, and therefore, I'm not aware of every court case, but a number of court cases say you cannot, it's not valid to compare somebody who died in 1942 and try to determine who they were and make comparisons with these people and people today. And so therefore, I'm skeptical of, if 1942 is a problem, what about, Neanderthal or 5,000 years old? I have a problem with that.
Or 500,000 years old, like the evolutionary model would propose. And so how would we find intact DNA if that were the case? I sometimes wonder if the evolutionary model is true and Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were separated and isolated from each other for hundreds of thousands of years. And then Homo sapiens came out of Africa, met with groups like Neanderthals, Denisovans. How were they able to interbreed? How are they fertile if they were separated for so long? You'd think that there'd be enough genetic change there where they're not interfertile. And correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Bergman, we have their genes. A great population of humans today have Neanderthal genetics.
Right, and that includes me. When I had 23andMe do a genetic analysis, they found I had a fairly high number of Neanderthal genes. And when I talked to others, I find it's not uncommon. And that could well be because my background is Germany. And so Neanderthals lived in Germany. And so therefore, I probably am related to the Neanderthal persons. You know, back the great grandfather was likely a Neanderthal who interbred with others. So,
were Neanderthals post-flood?
I would say, yeah, they would be. Although it's, you know, when you find bones, could well be pre-flood, died in the pre-flood, but I'm not sure if we have looked into that in very much detail. I don't know.
Would the ones that are found in caves, would that be an indication that maybe they're post-flood? If we would argue caves were formed from the flood or after the flood?
Yeah, that of course would argue for post-flood. That's true. It would, but not. Some are found in caves, but of course others are found buried. So
right.
Uh,
so if they're closer to the flood, if we did, for sake of argument, let's say we did have reliable genetics, would we expect them, therefore, different genetics than extant humans today? I mean, if they're closer to the flood, that's going back thousands of years ago. We'd expect, as creationists, some differences in the genetics. Is that right, Dr. Bergman?
of course, yeah. That's what you look at when you do genetic analysis. You look for. In fact, there's so many differences generally when they do work in forensics. Generally, you don't look at all those differences because there are too many. You can't evaluate. So generally, when they do genetic comparison, they look at very specific genes, very specific fragments, and they're able to find enough differences in those small fragments to make the determination without having to sequence the whole genome. Although now, of course, they could do that pretty inexpensively, but in forensics, you're basically looking at a fairly small selection of genes, which are kind of the ones especially that vary a lot, of course, and ones it's easy to do. Easy to sequence.
I've read a number of papers, at least recently, Dr. Bergman, that suggest Neanderthals were very isolated, existed in small tribes, and as a result, they were incredibly inbred. And so a lot of those recessive mutations came to the forefront and led to rapid genetic degeneration. Do you think some of Go ahead. You can speak to that.
That's likely what happened.
Would that therefore then explain if the DNA is reliable? That could also explain why there are some significant differences if Neanderthals really were this widespread in their inbreeding?
I agree. That's one good hypothesis. We're coming out with more and more information about Neanderthals, so
yeah,
expect some of these questions to be answered in the future.
Do you think some of these Neanderthals were examples of humans, maybe even immediately post-flood, that lived hundreds of years old?
Could be, yeah. And it could be the distortions we see as a result of longevity.
Right. I wonder what you would think then, if we have humans post-flood like Neanderthals living 200, 300, maybe 400 years, would that mean they're also accumulating more mutations and therefore pass on more mutations than, say, we would today if we only lived to 70 or 80?
Yeah, that could be, yeah.
Well, there's a lot of interesting hypotheses we could discuss with Neanderthals. So you made some great points. And you pointed out how they bury their dead. They're a sophisticated people. If they're burying their dead, would that not speak to spirituality and religion?
Right. Afterlife, yeah. And flowers were added to the grave quite consistently, as well as other things. So the flowers, you can do analysis of what's left of them and determine, I guess, you could probably do genetic analysis and determine what kind of flowers they were.
Yeah, that's a real challenge to many in the old Earth creation camp that argue Neanderthals were just beasts and not human. That's a major challenge to them.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, here's another question. Jerry, you were with us going back about a year, maybe. You and I did a series on human evolution. So I highly recommend people check that out if they want a really detailed answer to this. And then I also just did a 3-part series with Dr. Peter Lyell on human evolution, who you've worked with on that book, Apes as Ancestors. Excellent book. So I guess briefly, the question here, since it's brought up quite frequently by those in the evolutionary camp, Jerry. What is the best way to address Lucy as evidence for ape-to-man evolution? Because the evolutionary camp, they'll argue that Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, is your perfect transitional form between apes and humans.
Well, I would say so much of it is not human, but ape. In fact, the claims that certain parts were human are pretty specious. Of course, the hands and the feet is one argument they use, but they don't have Lucy's hands or feet, but they have other Australopithecines' hands or feet. But, when you start comparing bone fragments like this, it becomes more and more difficult. And you realize that in forensics because you've got to prove in court your claims that you make. And I guess one in forensics is, especially if you're defending a client, he's more aware of some of the problems in these comparisons. And I see so many problems in Lucy: size, structure, the body structure, and so on. And of course, that's been covered in not only my writing, but other writing as well. So, kind of a question like that, where do you start?
Right. There's so much. And that's why I wanted to point to your previous presentations. They'll oftentimes look to the pelvis of Lucy and argue that the pelvis of Lucy and a lot of your Australopithecines are more similar to humans than to extant apes like chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas. What would be a good response to that?
Well, in some ways it is, but in some ways it isn't. Of course, the problem with that is the skeleton is broken up into pieces and we had to put them together. And how you put them together, of course, would be influenced by your belief in what they were. And that's why you have some anthropologists that say, no, it's very human-like, and others say no, it's not. But the question is it indeed an Australopithecus afarensis area, bones? And that's when you find bones in different sections. A lot of these bones are found because they're animals that died and they were consumed by other animals. And therefore the bones were spread out in a wide area. And that's why you generally don't find a lot of bones that is clearly proven to be part of one animal. And that's hard to do even if they were found fairly close together, but they're often not. They're often found in quite scattered areas. And of course, often you have bone fragments. Now, Lucy is one of the most complete skeletons we have, 40% complete? But when you look only at the weight of the bones, if you have part of a femur, they say, well, you've got the femur bone. But if you look at the weight of the bones, it's closer to 4% complete. And so therefore, it's not as complete as it appears to be. And this is one of the most complete. And so therefore, and it's still controversial. One way of looking at the evidence is to look at the critics, not creation critics, but the other evolutionary critics. And they generally do a really good job in showing some of the problems. So we don't need to evaluate them ourselves. We can let the other paleontologists do that. That's if you're where Peter Lyell's work. That's basically what he did. He took each claim and looked at the critiques, the evidence by other paleontologists. And that's basically what his chapters in my book are all about. What the other experts have to say about this find. And the same thing is true with Lucy.
Right. Each of those paleoanthropological data points are contested by one anthropologist or another paleo. And so with the Australopithecines, from a creationist perspective, Dr. Bergman, would we see these creatures as basically an extinct type of ape that may have lived for a short period of time after the flood?
Could be an extinct type of ape, or could just be an ape, or could be, and there are some people, we have to admit, that have very ape-like features. And you can't really say this with any certainty, but indeed it could be some of these cases where it was a human that had ape-like features, which died, and we have the bones, and therefore we can make certain claims about them, even though the claims are not very valid. A lot of supposition, a lot of guesswork. Right. What I find in reading the literature is that they come to the literature with the belief that evolution is true, and their evolution glasses, they call that, distorts reality. Not that they do this purposely, but that they see evolution is true. Therefore, this must mean something that fits into our evolutionary worldview. That's a big problem in reading the evolutionary literature. They just go into the information with this preconception, and that really distorts what they see. Because I can read the same facts and come up with a very different conclusion, and I have to wonder why they came up with this conclusion. Well, they're wearing evolution glasses.
Right.
Now, of course, they might say, well, you're wearing creation glasses. Well, put on both pairs and see what's there. That's the best way. But of course, they don't put on both pairs. We have to put on both pairs because they do. So therefore, we have to look at it from their vantage point. But on the other hand, they rarely ever put on the creation glasses. It's only the evolution glasses, and that's how they see the world.
Right. Great answer. Very important points there, Dr. Bergman. So on the issue of fossils, a major line of evidence that the evolutionary community looks to for not only human evolution, but also whale evolution. And so the question here on the screen, how do creationists, which you and I are, address the famous whale series? So you got Pakicetus, Ambulocetus, Rhodocetus, Basilosaurus, for example. What are your overall thoughts on that series?
I did a whole article on this, and it's pretty clear to me that what you are doing is taking different animals and lining them up, even though they are clearly different animals. Pakicetus, for example, and the others, they're clearly different animals, different category, and you're lining them up somewhat arbitrarily. Interesting, I went to a conference once, and the professor there was at the University of Kansas, and he was asked what is the most persuasive fossil evidence for evolution, period. And at the conference, he gave the whale. And I thought, that is really bad. If this is the best evidence, what does that say about all the other evidence in that? I think it's pretty pathetic. And again, you believe in evolution, therefore, the Pakicetus and so on, these have to be missing links. But in many ways, if you do comparisons, even from the printed literature, you can see that they're just very different kinds of animals. It's like you line up apes and you start out with chimp and you gorilla and then humans, you line them all up and you claim that one evolved from the other, when that is pretty questionable because they not only have to evolve new traits, but have to lose a lot of traits. And
right.
I don't see that as the key. I don't remember all the points in my article, but I did, in quite a long article, cover this in quite a bit of detail.
Right. And I think the point holds true even to whale evolution that you made earlier with human evolution, that a lot of the points are contested. I mean, Ambulocetus, I think it was Peter Gangrich, recently said that Ambulocetus must not be in that main lineage because the eyes are at the top of its head, kind of like an alligator. And so how can it therefore be in that main lineage? But one thing they like to point to, as you know, Dr. Bergman, and your book, which I have behind me, Fossil Forensics, you got an excellent section on this, dealing with the argument that says these whales have vestigial pelvis. Specifically Basilosaurus, they point to these hind limbs that exist, and they say this demonstrates that they used to walk on land as four-legged tetrapods. What's a good way to respond to that, Jerry?
Well, I remember the example I used, but it's not easy to calculate when you're a whale in the water, floating around, etc. And those legs that they have really facilitate copulation. And that same thing is true with snakes that have feet-like appendages. Facilitates copulation, which I don't see how they could copulate without having some type of means of ensuring that the copulation can occur. They go extinct, but they haven't gone extinct. And of course, therefore, copulation has to be successful. And with snakes that have these so-called leg remnants, tail, and the same thing with Basilosaurus.
And the fact that Basilosaurus might have more prominent, quote unquote, hind limbs doesn't further their evolutionary model, correct?
No, it doesn't. And from the literature I've read, it's pretty clear that they need to have these structures to be able to successfully reproduce.
Well, there's at least one paper from the conventional literature that I read that said, yes, these so-called hind limbs on Basilosaurus were used for reproductive purposes. those muscles and tendons and that structure helps with the reproductive organ. And so evolution requires the passing on of genes, right, Dr. Bergman? And so if there's no reproduction, then there's no evolution.
Right. That's it. It's the end.
So a lot of evolutionists, would you see this as a rescue device? So I see a lot admit now, well, okay, the vestigial pelvis does have a function in reproduction, but it's simply a function that's been repurposed. So they used to be hind limbs, but once they started to become reduced as they moved into the water, the ocean, now the function is been repurposed to reproduction.
Yeah, they use that, I agree, as a rescue technique, and that's reasoning. And of course, reasoning is cheap. When I taught forensics, you can reason all you want to, but you've got to have the evidence, you've got to present it to a jury, and you've got the defendant's attorneys. You don't have the evidence clear, the other attorney is going to tear you apart. And that's why before they go to court, they usually make sure that these ideas can be carefully documented in the court trial. And the same thing is with claims of a Bachelorosaurus. That's a rescue device, which my question is, how did they reproduce until they had those organs? If they were feet, how are they going to reproduce? They couldn't. So
right. That's a great point. There's so many major changes that would have to take place to go from a land dwelling mammal like Pakicetus to a whale like Basilosaurus, a blue whale. Can you touch on some of those changes? Maybe like, obviously they'd have to give birth to live young in the water. Now they'd have to have the nostrils moved to the back of the head as a blowhole.
Right. Yeah, a lot of changes that I think when I gave that example, that professor from University in Kansas, I think they really have a hard time arguing for the evolution of whales, and they do it the best they can, I guess. And it's not, I don't remember all the arguments I used in my paper. It's been like 20 years ago, but I have a book I did on the whole whale issue, and I haven't gotten it published yet. I need to find a publisher. I want to have a lot of illustrations. That would be important for this kind of book, but
yes,
you can only do one thing at a time. And I'm rewriting, by the way, the Scopes Trial book. I found so much good information that I want to rewrite it quite extensively, partially because my first book is the first book that really pointed directly in the idea that this whole concern was racism. And I need to defend that better, and I need to go into more detail to a lot of these things that I raised in my first book. So,
very good. Sticking with fossils, you've recently written a couple articles, if I'm not mistaken, Jerry. You put out some great resources that I highly recommend people check out. And you wrote some recent articles on living fossils and why they contradict evolution and also an old Earth. Can you speak to this a little bit?
Yeah, the best example is that we have the theory that we have a worm, and just many types of worm, but basically the evolutionary scenario is we all eventually evolve from a worm. So this worm, one worm, evolved through the evolutionary tree into humans. Another worm evolved into nothing, still a worm. So why is a worm still a worm, hasn't changed in 5 million years, whatever, and yet this other worm has evolved into a human? Another worm, which I just did an article on, evolved to produce very human-like eyes. So how do we get this worm that the only evolution it utilized was to evolve eyes which are very similar to human eyes? They're camera-type eyes. And so one worm evolved human eyes, another worm evolved into humans, another worm didn't evolve at all. And of course, you could go on and say, well, this worm evolved into birds, this worm evolved into bears, this worm evolved into whatever. And of course, that's what evolutionists teach, but they don't put it all together in this way. And you can do that, but they teach part of our evolutionary history is worms. That goes back in all of our evolutionary history. But why did so many of these worms not evolve into anything else besides worms? Why did some evolve into people, some evolve into birds, some evolve into mammals, etc.? So you have this when you put it in those terms, people realize how foolish it is. And that's a
Right.
good example of the evolutionary fossils, the fossils that didn't evolve.
In my personal life, talking to skeptics, but they're not highly indoctrinated into evolution, I'll oftentimes ask them if they believe in evolution, and they say, of course. But then when I educate them on what that model says, that, as you've put it, bacteria-like organisms over billions of years turning into whales, humans, evolutionary theory that teaches we're related to banana plants and worms, they're flabbergasted. And even they realize how silly that is. And I think it's important that you make those points evident. And so on living fossils, correct me if I'm wrong, the coelacanth. I think the evolutionists argue that the coelacanth lived 400 million years ago in the Devonian, the so-called Devonian period. And then, so even before the dinosaurs. And then supposedly the coelacanth goes extinct. And during that time, the dinosaurs come about, the evolution of mammals, the evolution of humans. And then what do we find today swimming around in the oceans? Coelacanth.
Yep.
And so is that an example of a living fossil, Jerry?
That's a classic example, one of many. And I'd like to do a book on that because there are hundreds of examples. But that's one of the more famous examples, partially because we're talking about an animal that the evolutionists claim lived millions and millions of years ago. They say it didn't evolve because it evolved to the certain point where it did well in its environment. And in its environment, there was not any natural selection to push them to evolve into something else. So that's how they claim to respond to it. But again, these are ad hoc arguments that are problematic because you can come up with all kinds of arguments to justify all kinds of things. And that is a problem I see in evolution, especially.
Yeah, I just find it humorous in the most professional way, I guess you could say, that during that time where coelacanths basically remain largely unchangeable, 400 million years, you had the evolution of reptiles to mammals, mammals to some monkey-like creature, and then a monkey to a human. Those are some massive changes. All the meanwhile, coelacanth remains unchanged. And so my question to you is it kind of a double standard? Because as you know, proponents of evolution, they'll oftentimes argue from the ordering of the fossils. They'll ask questions like, well, why don't we find whales and ichthyosaur, or whales mixed with a megalodon or a pterodactyl? But wait a minute. If coelacanth existed for those 400 million years, well, why don't we find coelacanth and humans in the fossil record? We know coelacanth and humans live together. And so is it kind of a double standard with that question, Dr. Bergman?
Well, it is. And from my work in paleontology, from the sidelines pretty much, it's amazing that when they just make these discoveries, and I've talked to people who mentioned this to me, not a lot, but a couple, when they just find a discovery, they have two animals that don't belong in the same fossil strata at all. They then basically, well, there must be a mistake. There must be something wrong. And they're afraid to publicize it because it could cause derision against them and it could affect their career. And so my guess is many cases of where two fossils are found together in the same strata, close to each other, that don't belong at all in the same strata, and they're finding this, people are afraid to mention it, because it must be something wrong. And therefore, for my career, I'll just ignore the finding and that conclude it's a fake, or that this was deliberately buried. You've got an animal here that's part of the fossil record. The other animal was buried for some reason, a crevice because of an earthquake. It was buried way below in an earlier fossil record. Why are they found together? Well, these are, my guess is there's a lot that have been found together. Of course, 90% of all fossils are marine?
Right.
Large percent. So
marine fossils mixed all throughout the rock strata, right from the bottom to the top.
Yeah.
And so there's a skeptic in the chat, Dr. Joel Duff. I appreciate it. We like our skeptics and non-skeptics here in the audience. And so he argues dragonflies haven't changed over that time as well. Actually, most types of animals haven't changed much over 400 million years. And so an evolutionist might think that's evidence for their theory. But in reality, isn't that evidence for the young earth creation position that yes, they haven't changed because they haven't existed for 400 million years?
Well, that's a good point. Yeah. And I think he's fully correct, because more and more cases I find, and that's why I'd like to do a book on living fossils, because there are more and more examples of living fossils. And this is a good example of dragonfly. Of course, dragonflies were larger back then. So we have smaller, they not nearly as, didn't develop near as large today as they did back then. And so, yeah, that's a good. The problem is, though, what percent of any animal has been preserved in the fossil record? Very, very small percent, except you have a few examples that are exceptions. But so, yeah, that's a good. Most types of animals, that's true, haven't changed much over the 400 million years. But on the other hand, some have changed, according to evolutionists, a lot during the 400 million years. Awful lot, like humans.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're out. So the ones that haven't changed, that doesn't surprise me. What surprises me is when they make claims of animals that have changed enormously in 400 million years. And I forget all the dates that they use to date man's changes from ape to humans, but 400 million years, I think you'd be going back pretty far in the evolution of man.
And we see some rapid variation today. I mean, they just came out with a study, I think it was last year, on the Galapagos finches and how they've observed new variations, or what they call new species, in real time. And that's, as a young earth creationist, correct me if I'm wrong, that's what we would expect based on pre-programmed variation and design diversity, that yes, we can get new variations quickly. But if the evolutionary model is true and these creatures haven't changed in 400 million years, well, that just begs the question.
Yeah. If you take the flood model picture, there'd be one pair of horses in the ark, one pair of dogs in the ark, one pair of cats in the ark. You have, I'm told, you have something like 400 different breeds, or let's say 200 different breeds of horses. There's opinions vary on that. Well, let's say there's 200 different breeds of horses. You have horses about the size of a German Shepherd, other horses that are 9? I just did an article on horses. Some horses that are about the size of an elephant. There's a huge difference. Not as fat as an elephant, but length, height-wise. So you have huge variations in horses. Obviously, dogs is well known. So if we assume the ark model, we've got 2 dogs in the ark. And of course, this really is basically what evolutionists teach, because they say we start out with the wolf kind, period. All dogs today evolved from the wolf kind. Right. So that we know that because we, by and large, did it. So if the variety we see today in the dog kind and the wolf kind indeed shows that you have an enormous amount of variation, even though you only have, and of course, that's the exception, the idea of evolutionists, that you have the wolf kind, and from that, we have the different varieties we see today, which is huge. We have a dog that weighs 8 pounds at the best. My daughter had a dog that weighed, if I remember, like 140 pounds.
Right.
Horse is mastiff. As far as I get, the horse in many ways, the size, huge difference. I mean, a gross difference. Not only difference in the size, but also a difference in so many traits. But yet they claim that these all evolved from the wolf. And of course, creationists recognize that this is the source. But of course, we recognize it because we did it. We know who people did it. The German Shepherd was probably bred in Germany, and you know, so we can often tell where the dog was bred by the name.
Isn't it right as well, with all of this, these amazing changes that you're talking about just within dog breeds, let's say, or horse breeds? It's really just morphological adaptability or morphological variation rather than any real significant anatomical change, which is what the evolutionary model would need, is new anatomical features, not just variation in morphology.
Oh yeah, they need to go from worms to people, and there's a huge variation. And what amazes me is we have as many people do today, we have a mixture in our dog. Mm-hmm. And I'm just amazed that they can, quite different dogs can breed. And the new traits seem to blend in quite well.
Right.
And they either have certain traits from one animal, other traits from another animal. And I wonder, how in the world do these blend so well? that they just fit together, almost like the design is such where they're designed to blend in well. So they have certain traits from, in the case of our dog, from a big dog, and we have a small dog. And so why doesn't it have some horrible body distortions, considering the father compared to the mother? But it doesn't. It seems to have either a blend, or it has one trait or the other trait. Like our dog, part of it's poodle. So it has very clear poodle traits, but it has very clear traits from other types of dogs. And you get, it's amazing. You don't end up with animals that are just distortions.
Right.
They're monsters. It would seem to me, especially when you see the mom and the dad dog, why don't you end up with a monster? But you don't. You end up, as far as I'm aware, almost all cases, you end up with an interesting new breed with a variety of traits. You don't end up with a monster.
Yeah, that's a great point. These nice, neat phenotypes that come about due to pre-existing morphological variation, it appears that the best explanation, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that these traits you're talking about were pre-programmed. They were pre-existing. They're now being expressed rather than coming about through evolutionary processes like deleterious mutation accumulation.
Right.
Okay, well that's that makes me think. We were talking about living fossils earlier. Okay, we understand, and you've done a lot of excellent work on the nature of mutations. Actually, you gave a presentation, Jerry, here a little while ago on mutations in general. Excellent presentation. And so, if mutations are mostly deleterious, they're low impact, they accumulate, selection can't see them, then doesn't that put shelf lives on genomes? Which means if you look at some of these living fossils like the horseshoe crab, coelacanth, they can't actually go back hundreds of millions of years because mutations would have driven them to extinction.
Yeah, that's a major argument against the long ages that evolutionists use. And that's the work I did at the medical school. We worked with cancer. Cancer is caused by mutations, period. And we know an awful lot about mutations because, well, that job is cure cancer. And so therefore we know a huge amount of mutations. And from what I learned from the work that we did at the medical school, it's very clear that you're going to get, by and large, problems with the accumulation of mutations. And therefore, because of that work and my understanding of mutations, it's pretty clear that you're not going to get, without some type of repair mechanism. And of course, there is repair mechanisms which are utilized, but by and large, in the long run, you have accumulation of deleterious mutations, and therefore it's obvious that animals couldn't be 400 million years old. It couldn't be as old as they claim because they would have accumulated mutations to produce what they call mutational meltdown. And that's pretty well confirmed from all the work that I've done. And at the medical school, we recognize that it's true. And I didn't know anybody there who doubted that. And cancer is a result of the aging of the organism. That's why it's more common today than it was many years ago, except we have better health today, but we also have worse things like our food, which my wife does a lot of reading on. Our diet is not very helpful. Processed foods often are not very healthy. Right. The best foods you can eat: go out in the garden, pick the vegetables, clean them, eat them. That's the healthiest food that you can eat. This highly processed food is problematic, according to what she's reading, according to these doctors who are looking at the causation of disease. So genetic meltdown is clearly happening. It's clearly there. In fact, we know it's there in the medical field, and the goal we have is to counteract the genetic meltdown. So a focus we have is more diseases are occurring. We need to anticipate future diseases, and we need to begin to concern with how do we treat them? How do we deal with these diseases, which we know are going to come? 100 years ago, there was maybe 50, 60 diseases. Now there are, I think, about 5,000 or 6,000 different diseases caused by mutations. And so we know the mutational load is increasing. Now, of course, our knowledge is better because we've done more research in identifying these. But putting that aside, it's pretty clear that the mutational load with humans and all life has increased and will continue to increase.
Fantastic point. That's a great answer right there. I could make that into its own clip, as I've done. And so it makes me think, earlier you're talking about how a lot of these creatures that we find in the fossil record, Jerry, they are a lot larger than their counterparts today. If you compare the megalodon shark to a great white shark today, great white sharks are rather terrifying to many people like myself. And yet your megalodon shark was so much bigger. It was 60, 70, maybe 80 feet large. You talked about the dragonfly, which had a 10 or 15 foot wingspan. From memory, I think the apatosaurus, 70 feet, but yet had nostrils the size of a horse's nostrils. And so today it couldn't breathe in enough oxygen to survive it. So I guess my question to you is, what is the major reason for the larger animals in the past? Does it have to do with what you're talking about, the mutations, the environment, the food, the nutrition?
Probably all those things, but the main thing they tend to look at is the oxygen content of the air. It was higher back then, and therefore they were able to obtain more oxygen. But that's something that creationists really can't answer, but evolutionists can't either. We know the evidence is there. I mean, there's no question of the fossil record. We have organisms which are huge compared to those today. And dragonfly, of course, is only one well-known example. But we know that they've changed. But on the other hand, why? I think creationists and evolutionists probably say that the oxygen content of the atmosphere was higher back then.
Right.
And that's a main common reason. But I guess that's a good reason. But on the other hand, could be the mutational load is part of it. But we don't have many good mutation data and sequences of animals that lived 5,000 years ago. So I guess they're trying, and they claim to have some pretty good data, but I've often questioned that. And I think contamination is the big problem. You need to do mutational sequencing in a level 5 lab, because right now you have floating around in the room DNA. I know at the medical school, what we had to do was wipe down the cabinets because we had DNA issues. We also had, of course,
yes,
DNA, not anti-DNA, but the enzymes that broke DNA down. We had that, and that therefore we had to wipe everything down. We had clean rooms there as well, but it wasn't level 5. But we had rooms where you open the door and you get this burst of wind. They're pumping air in the room, which of course hopefully will pump out the possible germs or DNAs and RNAs. That's what I'm referring to. So that was a concern at the medical school. We had to wipe down all the equipment to eliminate the DNAs and the RNAs, because that would, of course, would affect the DNA that we're working with. So many things we have to be concerned about.
Right. You mentioned earlier the whales, but also snakes. So you pointed to snakes, how they have the so-called vestigial hind limbs that they use for reproduction as well.
Right.
I'm curious as to your thoughts. We've had a herpetologist, I think they're called, that's the studies at reptiles and snakes and amphibians. We had an evolutionary herpetologist here who debated years ago, and he pointed to some of these extinct snakes, fossil snakes, one specifically called Najash, where they have the prominent hind legs. And so from your position, would you say that at some point in the past we may have had snakes with legs, or that all of these fossil snakes with the supposed hind limbs are also for reproduction?
Yeah, I would say probably they were for reproduction, and they may be smaller today, but of course that's regression, that's not improvement.
Right.
But on the other hand, it's interesting. The Bible talks about the snake was cursed and lost its legs, will crawl on its belly for its life. So that's an interesting. When I mention this, some people say, "Now wait a minute. Scriptures talk about the snake that's cursed to travel on its belly for the rest of its existence." So I don't know. That's pretty much from what we have, evidence we have today. They're copulatory organs, and that's it. And then. But I need to look into that snake example, but I look mostly at living snakes, and so therefore we're able to
do that one. And it's an interesting one, Najash. I can send it to you through email, because with snakes, it's a little more curious than with whales, because like you said, in Genesis, the serpent was cursed, suggesting that serpents or snakes may have had legs, and maybe the curse was epigenetic in a way, where over time the genes for legs were shut down and they just slowly reduced. It's an interesting theory or thought.
That's true.
So we're winding down here on our last question or two. As always, Dr. Jerry, you're a fan favorite. We get a lot of great questions and a good variety of questions too. I think we've touched on quite a bit of important topics. And so this one comes in from Shepherd, $10 super chat. I appreciate the support for today's show. And so the question is this: is Dr. Bergman able to speak about the ancient Paracus?
Paracus, yeah, I think.
Okay, Paracus people of Peru, whose DNA points to Caucasian origins. If not now, maybe a future presentation. Do you have any thoughts on that, Dr. Bergman?
Yeah, there are a couple of cases where they found, especially disease in people in South America, which don't have the genes, and they couldn't understand how the disease would end up in South America. And they found, in this case as well as others, you invariably end up with some guy who got in a boat, came over to America 400 years ago, and mixed in and interbred with the natives. And I'm thinking of a number of diseases. What's the disease where they deteriorate early and I can't remember it. But anyways, they found a case. They know that this case occurred as a result in mutations somewhere a long time ago, and everybody who has it today is related to that person who had the first case several hundred years ago. And then they found somebody in South America, a group that also had the disease, and they found out that basically it's because somebody went over in South America with it several hundred years ago, and that's how the disease was spread to South America. So I wouldn't be surprised we have people who wandered the earth and may have got over there. Some Caucasians ended up over there and intermarried and bred with the people. So that's the most logical explanation of what happened. Although I don't know specifically about this case, but I'm thinking of Huntington's disease.
Yes, yeah. Huntington's
and I haven't talked about Huntington's. They used to call it Huntington's chorea, but now they just call it Huntington's disease. But they know a lot about that disease because everyone who got it came from a relative way back. And that's why it surprised them when they found cases of Huntington's disease in South America. But now we know why. But that'd be interesting to look into. You guys gave me 3 books that I have to work on now.
Yeah, we're keeping you busy, Dr. Bergman. Who needs sleep these days, right? Yes, Huntington's disease, very debilitating. In my nursing days, I had a lot of experience with that and other related diseases. And so Dr. Joel Duff here has a clarifying question, it looks like. Earlier, we talked about some humans in the fossil record that I think you pointed out they may have ape-like features. And so he's wondering, would that be some sort of degeneration of some kind?
It could be, or it could just be a conglomeration of genes which worked together and got some result. I did a search on the internet a while ago on the pictures, and I was trying to find ape-looking people. And I found quite a few ape-looking people. You could tell they were not apes, though. They were not traditional, but they were funny-looking people. And the fact is, you have a few people out there that are unique in their traits. And it could be a lot of reasons for this, but it was interesting that I did find a number of pictures of people who had some very unusual traits, especially the brow ridge where it's much larger. Now, that'd be useful to protect your eye. So why we lost that, I don't know if indeed we did, but I've had some injury slight in my eye, and that would have been prevented if I had the larger brow ridge. That would protect the eye, especially from sports. Of course, that's why you have protection in certain sports, but that would be very helpful to be protected, to have the Neanderthal eyebrow above the eyes. So yeah, it could be some sort of degeneration. Yeah, that's true.
Do you think because a lot of the human fossils that we find earlier, if that's the right word, in the fossil record from a creationist perspective, are those of Erectus, Heidelbergensis, Neanderthal? Would And I know this is mostly speculation, but what are your thoughts on the pre-flood or even Noah's phenotype? Would it be closer to an erectus or a heidelbergensis, or closer to extant human morphology? What do you think, Dr.
It
Bergman?
could be. I don't know, though. It's not. Of course, we have different centers today, and most of us are Caucasian background, although you may be interested. I assume you have Polish background. And the Germans thought that you are inferior race. And so they were, but they weren't sure because there were a lot of people. So they had a host of very complex system to determine how many inferior traits you had. And you probably wouldn't have very many, so you probably would have passed as German. But on the other hand, they found a lot of people who had the so-called inferior race of Poles. Although one governor in Poland, basically, he thought this was all baloney. And they all came in and he stamped them. You are now officially an Aryan. Congratulations. Everybody who came in, he just stamped them all. And basically, he didn't want to go through all this silliness as he was correctly thought it. And the other guy from the other part of Poland, who was killing a lot of these people, he complained to Hitler. And Hitler says, look, I appointed you to handle this area. I appointed him to handle this area. If he wants to stamp all these people Aryans, that's his business. Leave me alone. And I thought that in some ways it's really funny of what they're trying to do. And of course, there was a lot of intermarriage between the Poles and the Germans because the borders kept changing back and forth as a result. But it's interesting that Slavics, Poles and Czechoslovakians and so on were all considered an inferior race back then. But of course, this illustrates again how foolish some of these ideas are. I have a lot of relatives that are Polish on my brother's side. And so they always think it's interesting, but it's tragic because Poland was really decimated during the war. Not only when they attacked Poland, but when they retreated and the Russians were moving towards Germany, they decided the scorched earth policy. They decided to destroy Warsaw as much as they could while they were leaving. And as a result, they destroyed what was left of it. And the goal was that Warsaw will be totally leveled as they left. As they left. So here they're retreating. Why not just retreat and leave them alone? But they wanted to destroy as much as they could of Poland to deal with their ideas.
You mentioned it earlier in your presentation, your book on Hitler and Nazism and eugenics. What's the name of that book, Dr. Bergman, in case people want to check it out, purchase it?
Hitler and the Darwinian Worldview, I think.
Okay.
I come up with the title, and then publishers often come up with their own title. So I kind of ignore it because I'm thinking of the book with my title. But yeah, just look under Amazon, look under Bergman and Hitler, and you'll get. Actually, I've done 3 books in this area, so you'll get all 3 of them.
So a lot of these variations then that we're talking about in humans, in morphology, these distinct traits from around the globe, they came about after the Tower of Babel, when people spread out and became isolated.
Yeah, I would say probably. The Tower of Babel wasn't all that long after the flood, so we're spread out, and probably they were spread out according to people groups. So they probably their own kind. They went as a group, and so they. At least that's what we speculate. It's hard to know.
So if a couple groups become isolated, like Homo floresiensis, Hobbit, which we find on the island of Flores, they over time could be subject to degeneration, like you were talking about earlier. I mean, island dwarfism is a real thing. Mutations can accumulate.
Could be, yeah. I watched a film on the Homo floresiensis, and it really raised a lot of questions, and they tried to answer what they were and where they came from, and I don't think they answered them very well. So I got away from the film. It's a good film done by the people who discovered these bones, but they basically concluded, well, we don't know. We don't know what they are. Whether they're just small people, or whether they were different. Whether diet was thing to do with it or what. Didn't know. So just interesting that you have this small group of people which are what, 3 feet tall, 3.5 feet tall?
Yeah, 3.5 to 4 feet tall. So, okay. Well, Jerry, you did an excellent job answering these questions. Fantastic presentation as always. It was very detailed. and it flew by. Your presentation really flew by. We've had a great audience with, as you've seen, a good variety of questions from both skeptics and non-skeptics. And so, Dr. Jerry, any final words, final thoughts you want to leave us with as we wind down the program?
I'll pick up a copy of my book on Scopes trial as the cornerstone of evolution, and how important racism was. Because still so many wrong beliefs are around relative to that. They believe we're ignorant. We all turned out to be wrong. And now when you look at the history, of course, evolutionists have shown the evolution side to be unequivocally wrong and us to be right. And that's the main takeaway about my presentation. And it's done so much harm, because that's where we started demonizing people who rejected evolution and accepted the Genesis record. And name calling is huge. And I've often wondered, why don't we do some name calling? Why don't we point out some, just change, instead of creationists, put evolutionists there, but that small brain. But
Right.
Christians don't like to do that. They don't like to demean other people. But on the other hand, they don't seem to be worried about demeaning us, the evolutionists. So.
Yeah, and as you've shown, it is 2024, and it's a great time to be a biblical creationist, because the evidence is on our side, and evolution is collapsing more and more every year, Brother Jerry.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, well, I've got your book here in the chat, and for people to check out, The Other Side of the Scopes Monkey Trial, Amazon. So please click that link, get yourself a copy. You won't regret it. I've got a whole library of your books behind me, Jerry, and many of your articles can be found in the description box of this video as well.
It's on other sites too, not just Amazon, but Barnes & Noble carries it. You can order from Walmart, believe it or not in the stores, but online. You can buy it online. So if you have an account with Walmart and you'd like to buy things from Walmart, you can buy it online. And just Christian bookstores carry it. So just about all the online stores carry it. So it's easy to find. I know people who don't want to buy from Amazon for various reasons. So
right,
you may want to look at the other Barnes & Noble. Barnes & Noble is a good source as well. And they don't tend to carry my books in the store, because they carry in the store bestsellers. And my books are never going to be bestsellers, although my Hitler book has done pretty well. But by and large, I'm not going to be able to, the main sellers are, of course,
conventional books too. We have in our area, the big bookstores are Chapters or Indigo. And so if you go there, you're not going to find much in terms of biblical creation, young earth creation, refuting evolution, unfortunately.
A few books on intelligent design made it
right
into Barnes & Noble. A few books, but Michael B. did pretty well with his book. But by and large, we're not, we attract a very select audience.
Well, I've got one of your newer books here, The 3 Pillars of Evolution Demolished. This is a big book. It's a comprehensive book. And this might be a good topic for the future for us to discuss or possibly present on, because this is a really good book, Jerry.
Yeah, the case is overwhelming against evolution. And it's embarrassing how many people accept it.
Amen. Well, it's been a blessing, Dr. Bergman. I appreciate the time that you've given to us, and also the hard work over the years upholding the truth of Christianity and defending biblical creation. So God bless you, and also the audience. God bless you as well. I appreciate everybody tuning in, showing support, offering your feedback, questions, challenges from our skeptics. We always welcome those. And so, okay, share this content around, because the truth is important, and we just want to get the truth out there to as many people as possible. And with that, Standing for Truth is out. God bless all.
Okay.